The restaurant owner chased away a poor old woman, but when she showed him a photo of her son, he fell to his knees before her. The city was shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and anxiety. Passers-by on the streets, their faces hidden behind masks, resembled gray shadows of ghosts that seemed ready to dissolve into the void at any moment. The only sign that they were still alive was the echo of their footsteps spreading through the deserted alleys. The air was saturated with the smell of antiseptics. From radios, televisions, and neighbors behind the walls, there were constant reports of new cases of infection and death. The quarantine, declared by the authorities in response to the spread of the coronavirus, had turned the daily life of the town's residents into a series of empty, monotonous days that looked alike, while its empty alleys resembled scenes from post-apocalyptic films, where each frame transported viewers to a deserted and destroyed world without hope and a future. James Richardson, the owner of a cozy restaurant on the outskirts of the city, looked through the large window of his establishment at the empty street. His restaurant, La Cucina, had once been a popular spot among locals and tourists, offering exquisite dishes from Mediterranean and other world cuisines. But now, with the onset of the quarantine, the tables remained empty. James's life story was simple and might even seem banal to someone. A former paratrooper, after finishing his military service, he returned to his hometown and started making money. Initially, he sold vegetables at the market, then hired people for their sale, and later, after saving some money, decided to open his own cafe, eventually turning it into a high-end restaurant for the upper class. He ordered and served guests Mediterranean oysters with exquisite white wine. An Italian chef he met in Rome and invited to work with him prepared excellent pizza and pasta, while a Chinese man, who had come to his town for some personal reasons and stayed, made sushi and rolls according to his own secret recipe. How long ago all this was? James thought, returning to his sad thoughts. The past few weeks might have been the final point in his career. The decision to close the restaurant had not been easy, but the health and safety of his employees and customers came first. It seemed like only yesterday he had sent his workers home with the promise that as soon as things settled down, he would gather them all again and they would continue their work. James was not a stingy or cruel boss. He always encouraged the waiters, stuck his nose into every pot on the stove, and demanded cleanliness, decency, and respect from his employees towards each other and the customers. "Guys, we are feeding people. People, not pigs." He conducted his little briefing in the kitchen, and even pigs deserve respect. And people even more so. Let's do our best, no mistakes. His military training helped James a lot. The developed character did not bend under the pressure of local thugs who tried to extort money from him. He remembered when 5 beefy guys came to his restaurant to extort money. "Well, Doc, it's time to share," one of them said, lazily twirling a folding knife in his hands. "With you? Why?" "If you want money, I have a waiter position open, but I can't take everyone. A couple of people, max," James remarked, standing up from the table. "Why are you so cocky?" "Let's step outside and talk," one of the guys suggested. Outside, the conflict was quickly resolved in favor of the businessman. For hefty guys quickly retreated after receiving a good thrashing, and one stayed and worked as a waiter in his restaurant until the last day. The conversation with the police was also short. Everything was according to the law, no other way. At one point, James was even tried to be prosecuted on a trumped-up charge. But the expensive lawyer he hired knew his job well and quickly resolved all the issues. Such behavior and fearlessness of the boss could not but arouse respect among the staff. They were afraid of him and admired him. Young waitresses dreamed of him as a potential husband, and elderly dishwashers and cleaners tried not to leave a single crease on the freshly ironed tablecloths or a single soapy streak on the crystal glasses. This state of affairs suited him quite well and brought a significant income, which he regularly reinvested into his own business. No wonder, expenses in such an enterprise are not always planned. A street table would tilt from bad weather, a drunken guest would break the dishes, a bartender would not show up for work, and a professional had to be urgently found, even at double the rate. All this time, James was and remained the soul of La Cucina. He created this place as a tribute to his mentor, the Italian chef Antonio, who taught him the intricacies of making real pizza and pasta. Now, silence reigned in his kitchen. He felt that each day without work brought him closer to inevitable collapse, to the loss of everything he loved, strived for, and had achieved over the years. With each passing day, the hope for a quick return to normal life was fading. The restaurant walls, which had recently witnessed joyful evenings, lively conversations, and ringing laughter, now seemed a mournful reminder that the world had changed. James now spent all his time poring over papers, trying to figure out which bills he needed to pay first to stay afloat. To take a little break and stretch his legs, James decided to go outside. The cool evening air slightly refreshed him but did not dispel the overwhelming sense of anxiety. James stopped in the park opposite his establishment. The bench by the fountain, where couples usually gathered, was now empty. Sitting on it, he thought about what he would do after the quarantine. Should he return to the restaurant business after the pandemic or start something new? The time of silence and stagnation had become a period of reflection and self-analysis for him. James stood up and continued his walk. He slowly followed his familiar route, stopping occasionally to look at the blocked entrances to cinemas, bookstores, and cafes he used to love visiting. Now, all of this seemed forgotten, like an old movie that no one rewatches anymore. James realized that nothing would ever be the same, that the pandemic had changed not only his plans, but the entire world. After some time, he approached the shop where fresh flowers used to be sold. Now its windows were empty, and a sign on the door read, "Closed until better times." James paused briefly, recalling how every Friday he would buy bouquets here to decorate the tables in his establishment. Now those flowers, like his restaurant, seemed only a shadow of the past. He walked past closed cafes, boutiques, and bookstores. They were all sealed up, like museum exhibits waiting for better times. But when those times would come, no one knew. At the corner of the street, near an abandoned bus stop, James saw an old man. He was staring into the distance, hugging his knees, seemingly blending into the gray tones of the urban landscape. James slowed his pace, and their eyes met. In the old man's eyes, there was not only fatigue, but also a kind of unwavering calm that made James stop. "What a beautiful day for a walk, isn't it?" the old man said unexpectedly, his voice weak but with a spark of life. James sat down next to him, keeping a distance. "Beautiful," he thought, but out loud he said, "Yes, in a way. The city seems completely different when it's empty." "Cities, like people, sometimes need a pause," the old man replied quietly, "to breathe and once again appreciate what we have." These words made James think. Perhaps that was how he should view this forced break, as an opportunity to breathe and rethink many things in his life. "You're right," he said, "sometimes we are so consumed by everyday life that we forget to stop and just look around. And when we do, the world appears to us in a new light." The old man smiled. They both silently watched the deserted streets where time seemed to have stood still. For James, it was a moment of clarity. He realized that despite all the losses and uncertainty, new opportunities and new doors were still open to him. They said their goodbyes, and James decided to return to his restaurant. His soul regained a sense of calm that had long eluded him. Entering his office, James took up a pencil and paper, deciding to start planning the future of La Cucina. After such a brief conversation with the old man on the deserted city street, he felt inspired and saw the situation with new eyes. His hand confidently glided over the page, writing down the ideas that flashed in his mind. Organize home delivery of restaurant meals so that people can continue to enjoy the food even when they cannot leave their homes was the first item on his new to-do list. Thinking about how to adapt the menu for packaging and delivery, he felt a surge of energy again. He worked until the evening. When the streetlights were already lit outside, he looked up and saw the portrait of Antonio hanging on the wall, the man who had taught him not just to cook, but to appreciate the beauty and taste of life. "What would you do in my place, Antonio?" he wondered suddenly. Taking his old notebook with him, James turned off the light, locked the restaurant, and went home to his small apartment, where only silence awaited him again. Loneliness was a routine for James. He lived all alone in a small, cozy apartment, sometimes even envying the loud squabbles of his neighbors heard through the wall. Who would want a man with PTSD who belonged in a psychiatrist's office? He thought to himself. Only gold diggers showed interest in him, but he didn't want that even for free. He longed for feelings, romance, tenderness. He would have loved to brighten his bleak existence by getting at least a cat, since his personal life wasn't working out, but alas, he couldn't afford even that. It wasn't about allergies or fear for the wallpaper. He simply understood that he would doom the animal to the same dull and lonely existence in which he himself was stuck. Before COVID, he was always busy with work, often not staying home overnight, and the poor cat would have had to sit by the door for days, waiting for its happiness to finally come. He didn't want such a lonely life for an innocent animal. His heart ached at the mere thought of how the kitten would miss him. And what kind of soldier am I? He bitterly smiled, closing the page of another animal shelter, feeling sorry for a cat. Some people don't even feel sorry for humans, and here I am ready to shed a tear over fantasies about a kitty. Coming home, James tossed his keys on a small table by the entrance and slowly walked into the apartment. He turned on a small desk lamp, which diffused a soft light into the corners of the room, and headed to the kitchen. While he was making tea, his thoughts wandered far away. He remembered the days when his home was full of laughter and conversations with friends who often dropped by. Now his only companions were a cup of tea and heavy thoughts about the future. After the tea was ready, he took a mug and settled into his favorite chair by the window. Occasionally, ambulances would rush by outside, heading to the next infected patient, their sirens breaking the gloomy night silence hanging over the city. This sound was a harsh reminder that even in his solitude, the world's problems continued to exist. James thought, what will happen next? How do I keep the business alive? Will I ever get my old life back? These questions swirled in his head, giving him no peace. Suddenly his gaze fell on an old photograph on the wall, where he was depicted with Antonio and other friends at the opening of his restaurant. This reminder of past successes and joys inspired him. He smiled softly, recalling the warmth of those days. I need to pull myself together and think about the future, not despair about the present, he thought. Leaving his mug on the windowsill, James stood up and walked over to his desk. He pulled out his old notebook again and began jotting down ideas that could help him revive the business. Thoughts about new concepts for La Cucina, opportunities for online orders, and takeout now seemed quite feasible to him. James knew there was a lot of work ahead, but he now felt the strength to tackle it. He studied various strategies for attracting customers, thought about themed evenings that could be organized once people started going out again. He also considered charitable activities to support those most affected by the pandemic. This could not only help others, but also improve the restaurant's reputation, making it known as a place that cared for people even in the toughest times. After several hours, James felt fatigue finally catch up with him. Turning off the light, he headed to his bedroom, to his empty and cold bed. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight barely lit the room, James was awakened by an unexpected knock on the door. It was too early for visitors, and he instantly tensed up. Who could be coming so early? He slowly got up, put on his robe, and went to open the door. Standing at the door was a middle-aged woman, dressed in a simple but neat dress. Her face seemed familiar, but James couldn't recall where he might know her from. Sorry for the early disturbance, she began, her voice trembling with excitement. My name is Eleanor. I knew your mother. James stepped back in confusion, inviting the woman in. His mother had passed away many years ago, and any mention of her always brought a feeling of sadness. Come in, he said, trying to hide his anxiety. Eleanor slowly entered the apartment and looked around. You must be surprised to see me, she continued, sitting on the couch in the living room. I was a friend of your mother's in her youth. We hadn't seen each other for a long time, and when I learned of her passing, I couldn't find the strength to come immediately to express my condolences. James sat across from her, staring into the face that still seemed familiar. Mom rarely mentioned her friends from the past, he said softly. But I'm glad you found me. Eleanor smiled, but tears glistened in her eyes. She silently handed James an old envelope, as if she knew the role this letter would play in his life. James took it, feeling his heart pound. His mother's handwriting on the envelope was immediately recognizable, neat, almost calligraphic. It reflected her character, beauty, effort, and an unknown strength. Carefully unsealing the envelope, James found a letter inside, dated a few months before his mother's tragic death. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read the message written in her gentle handwriting. My dear James, I always wanted you to know that you were the light of my life. Since the day you were born, I felt my life filled with meaning and joy. You were and remain my greatest achievement. Watching you grow and become the wonderful person you are now has been my happiness and pride. I remember our joyful walks in the park, your first steps, and your dreams about the future. You were always my little explorer, ready to conquer the world. You have overcome a lot, and I have always believed in you. My dreams and hopes have always been tied to you, and I know you will do something great and big. Stay on your path, remember your dreams, and follow your heart, my dear son. With love, your mom. His mother's words touched James to his core. He recalled the moments when she looked at him with pride in her eyes, when they laughed and cried together out of happiness. These memories were like rays of light in his dark world. Eleanor, silently observing him, nodded understandingly. She was very proud of you, she whispered. You were her joy and the meaning of her life. Folding the letter back into the envelope, James carefully placed it next to the photographs he also found inside. One showed his mother, young and smiling, surrounded by friends, including Eleanor. They stood in front of the university building where they once studied together. In another photo, James was pictured on his first day of school. In the photo, his mother was nervously holding his hand. James smiled, seeing how she looked at him from the photo, as if trying to convey her strength and support through time and space. As he bid farewell to Eleanor, James felt inspiration and determination fill his heart. This woman had brought him not only memories of his mother, but also new energy to move forward. Now, facing life's challenges, he knew that his memories of his mother and childhood would be his support and direction on the path to his goal and surely happy destiny. Opening his laptop, he began to research current market trends, the needs of his visitors, and analyze what his restaurant could offer that was unique, something his competitors never had. James realized that times had changed. People now preferred not only quality food but also safety. He started planning the implementation of contactless delivery and special sanitary measures to guarantee his clients the best quality food in town and safe delivery. He also considered organizing online master classes for cooking exquisite dishes. This could attract a new audience and at the same time create a sense of community among his regular guests. James smiled, imagining his clients laughing and interacting through screens, cooking something according to his recipes. After several hours of work, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. The city was gradually waking up. The streets, which had seemed so empty and gloomy in recent months, were starting to come to life. It seemed that life was beginning to improve, he thought. Suddenly, he heard a phone ring. The name Veto flashed on his mobile screen. It was his former head chef. James's heart beat in anticipation. He quickly picked up the phone. Veto. It's so great to hear from you. How are you? James, hi. I recently returned to the city and was thinking, maybe it's time for us to start something new? Vito's voice sounded excited. James felt his fatigue instantly vanish. This was the sign he had been waiting for. Veto, I've been working on some new ideas. Let's meet and discuss them. I have a proposal you can't refuse. Great, James. I've missed our team. See you at your restaurant in an hour? I'll be waiting, James replied and hung up the phone. Leaning back in his chair, he couldn't suppress a smile. With enthusiasm, new ideas, and Veto by his side, he was confident he could revive his restaurant. Fate seemed to be playing in his favor. James met Veto at the entrance to his restaurant. Their warm embrace filled the empty space with warmth and hope. Together they walked inside. The restaurant seemed abandoned, chairs were still on the tables, and the morning sun played on dusty surfaces, enveloping the room in silence. "See, Veto, this place needs a fresh start," James said as they sat at one of the tables. "But before we get down to business, I want you to understand, for me, this is not just a business. This is a place where I hope to heal old wounds." Veto nodded in understanding, looking at his friend. He knew about James's turbulent past, the war, the immense losses and hardships he had endured. James sighed, a shadow of the past reflecting in his eyes. He looked out the window, where sunlight danced on the leaves of the trees, and decided to tell Veto what he had been silent about for many years, what caused him pain just thinking about it. "In my youth, I was very different. I saw horrors no one should have to see. We were sent to a place where it was almost impossible to survive. I remember walking through a ruined village. Everything seemed dead and lifeless except for one small school that stood untouched. We went in to take shelter for the night. But at night..." James paused, swallowing a lump in his throat, and then continued. "A rocket hit the school directly. Everything around was destroyed in an instant. Many of my comrades died that night." His voice trembled, and he fell silent again. Veto placed a supportive hand on James's shoulder. After a long pause, James gathered his strength and continued. "I survived thanks to a guy named Michael. He was a few years younger than me and always smiling. That night he shielded me with his body. When I came to after the explosion, Michael was already dead. I swore to myself that I would never forget him and would name my eldest son after him. He's watching from above and is proud of you, James," Veto said softly. "You're facing your fears and striving to make this world better, honoring his memory." James nodded, trying to hold back his emotions. He looked gratefully at Veto. "Thank you, Veto. Now that you're here, I feel we can start something new together. We'll breathe new life into this restaurant." James shared his new ideas and concepts for developing the establishment with Veto. His friends supported him and contributed his own suggestions. "Let's create a memorial corner," Veto said as they discussed the new design for the restaurant. "A place where our guests can learn about the stories of veterans, read about those who, like Michael, performed military feats." James agreed, "This will set us apart from other establishments. Our restaurant will not just be a place to eat, but also a place for reflection and a tribute to those no longer with us." Work in the restaurant was in full swing. The friends updated the menu, including dishes that were popular among soldiers at different times, as well as adding modern culinary trends. Veto experimented daily in the kitchen, inspired by culinary traditions from various countries, reflecting the world's heritage and heroism. The day of the restaurant's reopening was approaching. Everything was ready for the grand moment. However, a few days before the planned event, Veto unexpectedly confessed. "James, I have something to tell you," Veto began, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "I received an offer from a well-known restaurant in Europe. They're looking for a chef with my experience." James looked at his friend in astonishment. He always knew Veto was very talented, but such news, especially at such a moment, was a complete surprise. "Why didn't you say earlier?" James asked, trying to hide his disappointment. "I've been thinking about it," Veto admitted. "But your idea of a memorial restaurant. I want my culinary art to have meaning, as you said. But the new offer is too good to pass up. I've dreamed of working there all my life." "I understand," James said with a heavy heart. "You deserve the best, and I'm happy for you." Ultimately, the day of the reopening came, but the number of customers did not increase. Despite all the efforts and the updated menu, the financial difficulties of the townspeople after the pandemic still affected their orders. James was left alone. He pondered the future of his restaurant. Remembering his conversation with Veto, he realized his friend was right. His work had to have meaning. James knew his concept was unique and that he just needed to find the right way to attract visitors. Starting from scratch didn't scare him, but things still weren't going well. The number of quality suppliers had sharply decreased, and the clients, not yet fully recovered from the isolated life, were in no hurry to visit the once beloved little restaurant. Many guests' incomes had dropped sharply, and they now preferred to cook at home, not spending the family budget on dining out. James was once again overcome with fear and a sense of hopelessness. His restaurant was once again on the verge of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, outside, the sun was shining brightly. Sparrows chirped and frolicked in a shallow puddle near the restaurant entrance. Tired and sleep-deprived, suffering from a headache after the previous night, James sat at an outdoor table to try to pull himself together. His thoughts were gloomy. He understood that he wouldn't survive this crisis and might very soon have to close his restaurant, the work of his entire life. What are they so happy about, he thought, looking at the birds. Mud, hunger, predators, and hopelessness, yet they chirp without a care. If only I had such carefree moments and complete absence of problems, I'd be cheerful too. Even alcohol doesn't help anymore, and sometimes I just want to forget everything. Like yesterday, when we were seeing Veto off to his new job at a restaurant, and then we all lamented the never-ending crisis together. Out of sorrow, I had too much to drink and don't even remember how I got home. Just then, a waitress brought him a glass of cold beer, and for a moment, life seemed to regain some color. Ignoring the sympathetic glances of passers-by, he sank back into his distant thoughts. He remembered his service, the hot spots he had been to, and the civilians whose homes he had cleared. "Bring me vodka," he shouted to the waitress. "And a slice of lemon to go with it." In his ears, the powerful explosion that had taken the lives of many of his comrades echoed again, and before his eyes stood Michael, the young guy who had shielded him with his own body. If not for him, there would be nothing, no restaurant, no quarantine, no life. Once, he had promised himself to name his son Michael. But time passed, and his personal life didn't work out. At first, he wanted to earn enough money to buy a house where he could bring his wife. Then he simply couldn't find the right one. Yes, the young waitresses enjoyed his attention and flirted with him, but it wasn't the same. He was waiting for the one who would be with him through thick and thin. But such a person wasn't to be found in his surroundings. And now this crisis. Again, starting from scratch, again without her. James once again sank into his sorrowful memories. "Darling, what does all this mean?" James, holding a duffel bag behind his back, froze in the doorway. His girlfriend was rushing around the apartment, mumbling something indistinctly under her breath. She was gathering her scattered things. And in the armchair, some guy was lazily stretching. He didn't even hurry to dress, just pulled on his underwear and sat calmly, smoking a cigarette. Now it was clear why the apartment often smelled of smoke. "Honey, it's not what it looks like. Everything is different here." "Different? There's a man in his underwear behind you." "What's different here?" James cried out in pain and resentment. "You found out I signed a contract, and you immediately spread your legs?" A sharp slap sounded. James didn't immediately realize that his cheek began to burn. With eyes red from restrained tears, he looked into the eyes of his beloved. Rather, his former beloved. She, like a cornered rat, was trying to turn the situation in her favor, even accusing the deceived person of being rude and insulting. "Watch your mouth. And you watch your legs," he muttered. "I'll be outside on the bench. Pack your things, take your time, but be gone by today. At least take them to your own apartment, you witch." James recalled the story of his first love, which ended so treacherously, tragically, and banally. Time passed, and James, immersed in his thoughts, sat at the table until late evening. The establishment had long needed to close, but the alcohol was still affecting him, and his legs wouldn't obey. He mentally returned to the horrors of war that haunted him even in the silence of the empty restaurant. His heavy memories were interrupted by a modestly dressed elderly woman who approached the restaurant and sat down at a nearby table. "Miss, could I have a glass of water?" My throat is very dry, she asked the waitress. James raised his head and noticed the old woman hesitantly looking at the menu. I heard your restaurant serves amazing oysters and equally exquisite wine, she said in a quiet voice. I buried my son, my pension is small, but could you bring me 1 oyster and 20 grams of wine? We only serve portions, James interrupted, rising from his chair and approaching the old woman. And it's late, we're closing. Go to the store and buy yourself some proper food with that money. He was about to send the woman away, but suddenly, for some reason, he stopped. Very well, the old woman said, rising from her chair. I was told that someone who served with my son works here. I would very much like to meet him and ask about how my child died. With these words, she took an old photo from her pocket and handed it to James. At first, he turned away, but then he looked into her eyes and froze. In those eyes was a pain too familiar to him. He looked at the photo and immediately recognized the young face, Michael, the very guy who had saved his life. In his head, the deafening explosion sounded again, the crater left by the rocket appeared before his eyes, and the cracked helmet from which blood dripped. James fell to his knees before the woman, tears streaming down his cheeks. Michael was my friend, he whispered faintly. It turned out that Michael's mother's name was Margaret, and she had been alive and well all this time. In her eyes, hidden behind thin glasses, was the deep grief and unspoken pain of loss. Margaret was a frail old woman with snow-white hair, which she constantly arranged neatly in a bun on the back of her head. Her clothes were simple but well-kept, as if she always tried to look dignified even in the hardest moments of her life. The conversation between James and Margaret was long and heavy. He told the woman about her son's heroism. He had always been sure that she was receiving a pension for the loss of a breadwinner and did not need anything. But his surprise knew no bounds when he learned that Michael was still listed as missing and no money was coming to his mother. James pulled out a thin chain from under his shirt and showed Margaret his old army tag and another piece of metal engraved with the name Michael. These items symbolized his memory of a friend whose loss left an irreplaceable void in his heart. It rightfully belongs to you, James said in a strained voice as he took off the chain and handed Michael's tag to his mother. I carried it with me all these years. Never took it off, not even in the hospital. I hid it behind my back. It's the only thing I have left of Michael. Margaret silently took the cold piece of metal, as if it were her last connection to her beloved son. The tag was heavily worn and scratched, unlike the one James wore. She held it as if she feared it would crumble at the slightest touch. From the moment James handed Margaret her son's tag, that small piece of metal became another thread connecting their families, a reminder that the memory of Michael would forever be alive and vivid. The waitress quickly set the table, bringing out the finest wine and exquisite Mediterranean oysters. They talked all night, sharing memories and grief, and the next morning they went to the military recruitment office. Based on James' testimony, the elderly woman was finally granted a decent pension. A few weeks after meeting Margaret, James was closing his restaurant when he saw a young woman at the window. She was looking at the menu, but her gaze was thoughtful and distant. James went out to see if she needed help. "Can I help you?" he asked as he approached. The woman started, as if waking from deep thoughts. "Oh, sorry, I was just looking at your menu. I think I know you. Are you James Richardson?" Her voice was soft but confident. "Yes, that's me," James confirmed, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "My name is Anna. My mother Margaret told me about you. You served with my brother, Michael." Anna's words made James' heart beat faster. "Michael was a good man," James said quietly. "I owe him a lot." Anna smiled, but tears welled up in her eyes. "Please, join me for dinner," James offered, not wanting to part with Anna. That evening laid the foundation for their relationship. James and Anna started dating, and soon he realized he had found the woman who could be his life partner. Anna was intelligent, compassionate, and understood him like no one else. She was his comfort and support in difficult times. A year after they met, James proposed, and they got married. The wedding was held at James' restaurant, and everything was organized at the highest level. It wasn't long before they found out they were expecting a child. "We'll name him Michael," James said one evening as they sat in the kitchen, thinking about the future. "Why?" Anna asked, smiling, though she guessed the reason. "It's a tribute and a very old soldier's vow." Life for a life, James pressed his fingers to his nose, trying to hold back tears. "Your brother saved my life, and we gave life to his nephew." Anna placed her hand on her belly, feeling the first movements of the little life inside her, and nodded. "Michael, yes, it's a beautiful name." They didn't know what lay ahead, but they were sure of one thing: together, they could handle anything. It was the beginning of their new chapter, a chapter filled with love, hope, and the memory of a hero who was no longer with them. After their son was born, Anna and James redoubled their efforts to restore the restaurant La Cucina. Anna and little Michael brought warmth and coziness to the establishment, which had been lacking for so long. Together with her husband, Anna created a memory corner, turning the restaurant into a meeting place for those seeking delicious food and a center for veterans and their families. For many, it became a place for reflection and honoring the memory of fallen comrades. "We need to make our restaurant a symbol of life despite all losses," Anna said one day while discussing the new interior. James supported the idea, and now the restaurant's walls were adorned with photos, awards, and personal belongings of veterans, each item telling its unique story. This initiative sparked incredible community response. Social media was filled with stories about the project, and people began showing interest in the upcoming opening. Locals and city guests started coming to the restaurant to read the stories of heroes whose lives were marked by sacrifice and bravery. The restaurant turned into a living museum, with every corner reminding visitors of the cost of peace on our planet. Work was in full swing. James took on the task of restoring furniture, while Anna chose cozy decor elements. The new menu combined traditional dishes Michael loved with modern gastronomic delights. Every dish served was filled with care and respect for traditions. Finally, the grand opening day arrived. James and Anna eagerly awaited the arrival of their first guests. For them, it was an opportunity to start a new happy chapter in their life together. In the days leading up to this moment, the Richardson family had been preparing from morning until night to welcome their guests. When the long-awaited hour came, the restaurant doors opened wide, and the establishment was immediately filled with new voices, laughter, and joy. Some visitors came to support James and Anna, others out of sheer curiosity, and some simply to enjoy the excellent food and unique atmosphere of the place. The new, restored restaurant quickly became a symbol of a new life not only for James and Anna but also for the entire town. La Cucina became a place where people gathered to feel connected to the past and enjoy the present moment, where veterans and their families could meet to share their stories and support each other. James often held memorial evenings where veterans shared with the gathered guests all the hardships of war, humorous incidents from the front, and, of course, stories about their comrades. These evenings became a kind of ritual, helping the participants find peace and understanding of what had happened. "Our restaurant is a place where memories of the past help us build the future," James would say, welcoming guests to these evenings. Anna poured her soul into creating a children's play area where kids could play while their parents relaxed. This attracted many families, making La Cucina a favorite place for all generations. The restaurant often hosted war veterans who shared their stories and experiences with others. One cold evening, an elderly man entered La Cucina, his old military uniform worn but neat, each medal and award on his chest telling its own story. This was Edward Gray, a man who, at 85, still had a clear gaze and a straight posture. In his hands was a worn book, a diary he had kept during his service in World War II. This diary contained records of events that changed the course of history and the destinies of many people. James and Anna, noticing him at the entrance, immediately approached to greet him. Edward, with a warm smile, extended the diary to them, inviting them to immerse themselves in his past. "These are my memories of how it was then," he said with a quiver in his voice. When James opened the book, the first thing that caught his eye was Edward's neat, almost typewritten handwriting. The pages brought to life stories of fierce battles, friendships, betrayals, and unexpected acts of kindness between enemies. One of the stories described how Edward and his comrades found themselves cut off behind enemy lines and how, thanks to bravery and ingenuity, they managed to survive and return to their families. Edward's stories captivated all the restaurant's guests. They listened with bated breath to his every word. He, in turn, became a frequent guest at La Cucina. His stories not only enlivened the evenings but also inspired other veterans to share their experiences. When the last pages of the diary were read, a silence hung in the air of La Cucina. Edward quietly closed his book, and then applause filled the hall, while the veteran who had just shared his latest story smiled, looking at the young faces among the guests. Every guest and veteran usually left something of themselves in the restaurant as a memory, photographs, medals, letters, as a tribute and remembrance of the past. Edward was no exception. He left his Medal of Valor in the restaurant as a keepsake. This project attracted the attention of local media, and soon La Cucina became known not only as a restaurant with excellent cuisine but also as a place where history came alive, helping generations understand the value of peace and the sacrifices made for it. Edward and his new friends found in this corner the peace and recognition they had long awaited. Each month, the restaurant La Cucina firmly established its place in the hearts of the town's residents. It became a favorite establishment where one could not only enjoy delicious food but also honor the memory of the fallen. It turned into a cultural center where art, history, and gastronomy met. Meanwhile, James and Anna continued to develop and improve their establishment. They organized a series of culinary workshops conducted by veterans, skillfully combining their personal stories with the teaching process. These events attracted a wide audience, from young students to elderly gourmets. They were all interested in learning something new and sharing their culinary skills and thoughts. Anna, on her part, implemented a support program for veterans' families. She organized a fund to help finance education and medical needs for military personnel and their families. This added an additional reputation to the restaurant. Now it became not only a place of rest, but also a center of help and support. This restaurant has become something much greater than I could have imagined, James admitted one evening when he and Anna were closing the establishment. We have created not just a place to eat, but a living community that helps each other and grows with us. Little Michael quickly became a favorite of all the restaurant's visitors. His cheerful mood and childlike laughter brought joy to every corner of La Cucina. He often helped his parents, carrying dishes from table to table or just smiling at guests from behind the bar. From an early age, he began to understand the significance and importance of the place his parents had created. Seeing how well her son felt among strangers, Anna suggested organizing educational programs for children right in the restaurant. Such events could not only entertain the children but also teach them the basics of cooking and tell them about the history of world wars. As Michael grew older, he became even more actively involved in his parents' enterprise. He started proposing and implementing his ideas for the new menu and even learned to cook various dishes himself. His interest in cooking and history made a lasting impression on everyone. "Mom, Dad, let's do something special for the kids this year," he suggested one day. "Maybe we could hold a culinary festival for young chefs." The idea was so successful that La Cucina soon became known not only as a restaurant with a unique history and excellent cuisine, but also as a place where future culinary talents were nurtured. James and Anna looked at their son Michael with pride and confidence, knowing that they had built not only a successful business but also laid the foundation for future generations who would continue their work. La Cucina continued its mission, bringing generations together at one table, where the past and present merged into a single stream of time, enriching everyone who crossed its threshold.